Hello everyone! Been a while since my last full-on analysis video, hasn't it? Last time I did this was like, what? December? No, the Birdly analysis doesn't count. I know I promised the Kara analysis, but as I said on the Patreon, which you should check out, that video ballooned in scale, so I thought, why not give you all something a bit more bite-sized, huh? Anywho, let's not waste any time and just get into it, shall we?
So, knives, eh? What's the deal with them? I mean, I can't have been the only one to notice it, right? Knives just have a knack for showing up in these, what do you call them, quirky indie RPGs. They have a big role in Omori, Yume, Nikki, and of course, Undertale and Deltarune. Quite suspicious, if you ask me. Now, I'll be honest, my wife is much more knowledgeable on both knives and quirky indie Earthbound-inspired RPGs, and she told me something very, very interesting. Dr. Gashta, now, you wouldn't happen to have a couple of, androgynous human children lying around, would you? No? Well, it's a shame then. Sorry for bothering you. But, oh, just one more thing. I noticed you've been studying, Dark Worlds, and... Now, I don't mean to intrude, but I gotta ask. What if it could get darker than dark?
Alright, that's enough of that bit. That's right! The topic of today's video is knives in Undertale and Deltarune. But why? Why knives? Well, as Detective Columbo so eloquently put it, they are a frequent theme and symbol in not only Toby's games, but also several other games of the same ilk. And why? Well, that's what we're here to discuss. Before we can get into the weeds of the significance of this common symbol within these specific games, we first have to unpack its wider initial implications. In general, knives have a multitude of different connotations in fiction and literature. Most commonly, they represent a few different concepts. As a weapon, they tend to represent power, control, and deceit, and are usually given to duplicitous and imposing villains. In short, characters who want to assert their dominance over others. For example, in Macbeth, the titular Macbeth uses a dagger to murder the king and seize the throne. Thus, the dagger comes to symbolize Macbeth's ambition and lust for power, as well as his betrayal of the king. Furthermore, knives are also common symbols of violence and madness, often used by characters to kill people in fits of often senseless madness. The knife then comes to represent the illogical lengths people will go to commit acts of violence, a manifestation of insanity and psychopathy. This can be seen in films like Psycho as well as Halloween. This use of the knife seems to be very common in these horror thriller kind of stories. However, aside from purely negative things, knives can also symbolize resourcefulness and survival, being used to help a character survive a harsh and hostile environment like the wilderness. Thus, instead of becoming symbols of violence and evil, they instead become symbols of hope and a manifestation of the character's will to live. Their determination, if you will. This is usually seen in films where a character must make do to survive a harsh environment, be it in an abandoned island, the middle of the woods, the apocalypse, what have you. Also very commonly, they are wielded by duplicitous or tricky characters who use underhanded tactics to trick, and oftentimes literally, stab their victims in the back. Think of the rogue or thief classes in RPGs, or of characters like Loki from the MCU or Michael from The Godfather. Alright, that's enough wheel spinning on my end. We've waxed poetically about culinary tools in wider pop culture long enough. Let's turn our eyes to a particular pair of related indie games, shall we? The ones you all came here to hear about. Omori and Yume Nikki are very similar games at points. Yume Nikki is a clear inspiration for many of Omori's best sections, and Yume Nikki was also an inspiration for Toby Fox. Yume Nikki also has a notable cameo from our friend, the Knife. Yume Nikki's effects are a colorful cavalcade of weirdness, ranging from useless, to cosmetic, to detrimental, to very important. The Knife effect falls squarely in the useful bracket, being the only effect in the game to be able to kill NPCs. Now, analyzing the uses of this ability and how it fits into the wider themes and story of Yume Nikki is way outside of the scope of this video. There are many other videos that delve into it, but its simple inclusion, as well as its unabashed brutality and the destruction of these mostly harmless dream creatures, is noteworthy, especially as we move to talk about its spiritual successor, Omori. Omori's knife imagery is much more prominent than Yume Nikki, and its symbolism is exceedingly less subtle. I mean, we see it in action in the opening moments of the game. Not only that, but throughout the game, Omori's weapon is always that knife. He wields it in every battle and uses it to open the item watermelons, among other things. And always, its meaning stays the same. Omori's knife is a culmination of Sunny's self-harming desires and suicidal ideation. The part of him that keeps adventuring through the dream world every night, despite how it hurts him, despite how it's ruining his life. And in some endings, those dreams of hurting himself become more than mere fantasy. Then there is the final battle against Omori itself, the culmination of all of Sunny's self-hate, wielding the knife of self-harm. He heckles and demeans Sunny, calling him useless, less than useless, sick. It should be no shock that if you give up this battle, Sunny does just that in the bad ending.
Close.
This isn't even mentioning how the knife is used in Black Space against Basil, and how that resonates, or how this could be reflected in Yume Nikki's knife. But I feel like that's enough. After all, this video isn't about Omori. And after
7 minutes and 23 seconds.
we finally get to the meaty meat of the video. Let's talk about knives in Undertale and Deltarune. All in all, I have counted 4 noteworthy knives in Undertale and Deltarune. 3 of them are in Undertale, and as it stands, only 1 shows up in Deltarune. Can you guess whose it is? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get to the first knife you get in Undertale. Everybody give a round of applause for the one, the only, Stick! Wait, what? Hear me out. I'm not crazy. I'm not saying a stick counts as a knife. I am, however, asking you to take a note of something quite interesting. Watch this. Did you see that? That iconic attack animation of the red slash should be familiar to anyone who's played Undertale. Now, watch this. Same thing, right? Well, yes. The difference is that we're not wielding the stick in this footage. We have the toy knife equipped. Now, look once more. As you may have guessed, this attack animation is of neither the stick or the toy knife. This is the attack animation of the worn dagger, also known as the real knife. However, this animation is more than just a knife thing. I wanted to highlight these animations for these specific weapons because of how this animation isn't weapon specific. Over the course of Undertale, there are some instances where, regardless of what weapon you're using at the time, that recognizable slashing animation plays. Here is a non-comprehensive list. Landing the killing blow on Asgore in a neutral run, fighting Flowey in his boss fight and landing the killing blow on him, the final 2 attacks against Sans, the killing blow on Asgore at the end of the No Mercy run, the many blows that obliterate Flowey at the end of the No Mercy run, and finally, Kara's game-crashing attack on the player. Somewhat unsurprisingly, the vast majority of these instances happen at the end of a No Mercy run. An additionally interesting tidbit is that each instance takes place at a point where Toby expects you to be wielding the true knife. What I'm trying to get at is that the slashing attack animation is the default representation of an attack, of fighting. In short, a knife-edged slash is the representation of violence. But I didn't really need to go on that entire roundabout logical leap adventure. After all, the game served up that link between knives and violence on a silver platter right from the first encounter with the Ruins dummy. Now, let's talk about the toy knife. The toy knife is the first weapon you pick up in Undertale. Its description reads, made of plastic, a rarity nowadays. Whether the narrator is referring to the toy knife itself as a rarity, or plastic, is unclear. The latter would have big implications for life on the surface, while the former would have implications about the narrator. I feel like this is a good point to bring Narrakara into the analysis, as it will be important going forward. For this analysis, we will be considering Narrakara when discussing the narration. If you would like a deep dive into Narrakara, keep an eye out for the forthcoming hour-long Kara analysis. I have some choice words for Narrakara. And maybe, subscribe? Look at this sad graph. You can make this graph less sad. That felt kind of gross. You know what else is kind of gross? Murder! When you do a lot of murder, the contents of Toriel's house change. Or, more accurately, the contents of the narration changes. Of most interest is, of course, the line that goes, "Where are the knives?" Remember, we are analyzing this line through the lens of Narrakara, which at this point of the No Mercy run has been stated very, very plainly. At this point, Kara, who is being subsumed by our thirst for power, for higher numbers, is doing just that, looking for a tool of more power. Though, their question remains very salient, doesn't it? Where are the knives? It would be normal for a kitchen to have knives, naturally. I mean, there must be knives somewhere. Toriel had to use them to cut the pie, after all. So this line indicates something very specific from Toriel. She is hiding the knives. Now, why would she do this? Well, it's entirely within her overbearing motherly character to hide any potential threat to a child away from reach. After all, she child-proofed the tools in the living room. That's just how she is, isn't it? I have a question to propose to you. Why do you think Toriel is like this? Why do you think she's so concerned about children's safety, about ensuring they stay as far away from sharp objects as possible? Azul was never implied to be a reckless child or one prone to hurting himself. Red text is not indicative of Kara speaking, as some may believe. They speak very often in their dialogue in white. In fact, the blunt line, "It's me, Kara," is written entirely in white. Red is used in other places in the game outside of the No Mercy Kara dialogue. Of most note is when it's used to emphasize certain important words or phrases to the player. Interestingly, one of the instances where red text is used for Kara's narration in the No Mercy route is a simple, inscrutable ellipsis. Perhaps the red text is meant to highlight strong emotion within Kara. They don't feel strongly about simply stating who they are, but they do feel strongly about the day they fell, chocolate, their drawing, their family photograph, and yes, the knives. I hope you understand why Toriel felt the need to hide them. I suppose now that we're on the topic of new home, it's a good time to bring in the worn dagger, or how it's known in the No Mercy route, the real knife. According to its flavor text, the dagger is perfect for cutting down vines and plants. How apt! This additional info of the real knife heavily implies it belonged to Kara, probably used while gardening with Asgore. They did show an interest in flowers after all, being something they would have shared with their adopted father. It begs the question, though, knowing Toriel's aversion to children being in proximity to sharp objects, how could she ever approve of Kara having what appears to be a personal knife? Well, consider Deltarune for a moment. In Deltarune, Chris also has a knife that Toriel explicitly states belongs to them, which we'll touch on a little later. So what's different? Why is this Toriel so chill with her human child having a knife, when in Undertale she hides them and files down sharp tools? Well, from what we see from Kara in Undertale, she was totally fine with letting one of her children have a personal knife. It was only after they died that she gained her overprotectiveness in that aspect. And it is a very understandable aversion to gain after your children die, to ensure any future children are safe at all costs. It's the core of her character after all. But the specific ways Stoby has chosen to depict her maternal childproofing, the hiding of knives, the dulling of sharp objects, it's very deliberate. Going back to the real knife, I think what it represents is more or less simple. While the toy knife is just that, a toy knife, a weak weapon for weak players with weak stats, a beginner weapon in short, the real knife is the endgame weapon, the strongest, the one with the highest number, a comical 99 attack. Although of course, it is overkill at the point you obtain it. It is possibly a reference to the real bat in Mother 3, an endgame weapon that supposedly belonged to Ness from Earthbound. It is a very powerful weapon that is found just before the final battle that belonged to a previous protagonist. Both the real knife and the real bat are weapons that represent the peak of power in their respective games. The optimization of the battle system. The real knife as a symbol perfectly captures the themes of the No Mercy route. A thirst to see how far you can go, a thirst for higher numbers for more strength, a thirst to see all the game has to offer to obtain the ultimate item, not for any intrinsic value, but simply because it makes your stats needlessly bigger. A perfect weapon to preface the end of this route. Now, before we get into the next major knife to analyze, let's take a bit of a break and talk about a much more minor knife in Undertale. For the sake of being thorough, let's talk about Mad Dummy's knife in Undertale. Yes, I'm really doing this, don't worry, this won't take too long. So before they throw a knife at you, they say, "I don't need friends, I've got knives!" This serves as a wonderful little microcosm of Undertale's No Mercy route, doesn't it? You neglect the meaningful connections you have created within the world of Undertale, and instead focus on only getting stronger, on fighting and violence, on getting the numbers higher and higher until I'm out of knives. You run out of numbers to raise, of fights to fight. You reach the point of no return, where there is nothing left to raise to the ground. Anyway, let's actually talk about Deltarune now. Remember when I said that Deltarune currently only has one knife prominent enough to warrant analysis? Well, I was lying. Kind of. You see, knives show up in two plot-relevant points in Deltarune. There's the obvious one that you're all thinking of right now, and the one I want to preface this section with. At the end of Chapter 2, Queen begins to exposition about the knight and how they created the Dark Fountain, and would you look at that? A knife. Queen chose a knife as the weapon the knight used to open the Dark Fountain. Now whether that is accurate or not is irrelevant, as from what we know of Deltarune so far, the creation of a Dark Fountain is intimately tied with the image of a knife. Okay, we've established a connection to knives in Deltarune to the creation of Dark Fountains. So what? Well, now we can connect the knife imagery to the symbolic weight of opening a Dark Fountain. As has been spoken of to death in the past, Deltarune seems to be playing with the concept of escapism with its dark worlds. In a way, creating a dark world, or creating some sort of connection with it by making a fountain, could be seen as a form of retreating into the dark worlds of escapism. This can be seen as both a positive thing or a negative thing. An escape from your worries does let your heart feel free for fleeting moments. But indulge too much and, well, the world won't end and Titans won't subsume it all in shadow. But it might feel like it. In other words, the act of using a knife to open a dark fountain, while it may give short-term gratification and pleasure, is bound to cause more harm in the long run. I bet some strong ideas are already forming in your mind about where I may be going with this analysis, but I'm not quite done yet. There's a particularly important scene I have yet to bring up in relation to knives and Deltarune, and that's the Chapter 1 cliffhanger. In this scene, the knife is not associated with the creation of a dark fountain at all. So what does it mean in this scene? Is there some sort of overarching theme between this scene and the opening of a dark fountain? Before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's just focus on analyzing this one scene, and more specifically, the knife's role in it. To start off, it is imperative to mention the influence of metatextual factors in the construction of this scene, and really, in the totality of the light world sections. Specifically, we must mention how the light world sections, particularly in the context of survey programming, are meant to disorient and disarm the player and to force a mental link to Undertale. Thus, the use of knife imagery could simply be to call back to the fandom associations with Kara and the real knife in Undertale. Lord knows that's very much how a lot of people took it in the aftermath of Chapter 1's release. And I will concede, that connotation was certainly intentional on the part of Toby, at the very least as some form of red herring. However, in light of the new concepts and themes brought out by Chapter 2, this scene has taken on an entirely new meaning. We are now aware about the clear dichotomy between Chris and the player and the role that may play as the story develops. Which, of course, forces me to reevaluate the meaning of the knife in this scene. Let's consider the context of the knife. Chris pulls it out immediately after they eject the player from their body, giving them control again, giving them freedom. Consider both instances where Chris ejects the player at the end of Chapter 2. What do they do after they escape the bathroom? They use their knife to slash the tires of Toriel's car. And of course, they later use it to open the next dark fountain. Do you see the pattern? So far, every appearance of Chris's knife has coincided with them breaking free of our control. This knife is the symbol that links the plots and themes of the dark fountains and of Chris's situation. It, in a way, unites the entirety of Deltarune into an overarching narrative. So let's dissect it, shall we? What does the knife represent that unites these separate themes of escapism and freedom? Well, it's time for me to give my 2 cents on it. Let me present what I think it means. The knife so far has created a close link with the symbolic representatives of running from reality and into fantasy to escape the everyday problems that plague us, and of asserting one's own individuality. For the knife to symbolize a concrete idea or concept, it would have to be something that people do to assert some kind of control in a seemingly hopeless situation, while also serving as a way to at least, temporarily, fleetingly escape that situation. But what sort of thing, what sort of concept could encapsulate that dark cocktail mix of sentiments? Something that would make sense to represent with, I hope you understand why Toriel felt the need to hide them.
That suggests a necessity for privacy in the bathroom. I can't be the only one that sees this as such implications, right?
The culmination of all of Sunny's self-hate, wielding the knife of self-harm.
This as such implications, right? This as such implications, right? This as such implications, right? This as such implications, right?
Me and knives have always had a complicated relationship. There are some days where I still fear getting too close to one, but there are also days where I delight in staring at them in my hand, my eyes glazing over the metal sheen, the feeling of swinging it, spinning the tip on the table, the feeling of smooth metal in my skin. There's something about knives that keeps worming its way into the minds of people who want to make indie games focus on the aimless angst of youth. There's often a bittersweet feeling buried deep in the roots of this angst. One that's hard to suss out, hard to placate. And the knife serves as an easy and simple way to try and carve out that void. That amiss feeling. All the above games touch on the way their knives are used to fill that emotional void. Omori's knife explores how easy it is to fall into comforting fantasy and self-loathing. Undertale's true knife shows how easy it is to turn that void outwards and use it to lash out against those around you, to try and fill it with meaningless accomplishment and inflatable accolades in the form of overcoming false struggles. Deltarune's knife shows us how we fall into self-destruction in the face of helplessness and lack of control, and how these self-destructive behaviors can eventually lead us to a point of no return. But all these games also present a ray of hope. They propose an alternative way to fill that void, rather than attempting to cut it out with a knife. They propose filling that void, not with hollow fleeting emotions, but instead with meaningful connections. In Omori's best ending, Sonny must open himself up to vulnerability by allowing his friends back into his life, and in on the truth. In the pacifist ending of Undertale, you abandon your violent instinct and use the friendships you forge with the characters to break the barrier and create a new, happier future for everyone, giving you the most satisfying and fulfilling ending. It's too early to say for certain how Deltarune will end, but from what we've seen so far, I feel like it's pretty clear the emphasis it places on the relationships you forge with others. Chris, Susie, Noelle, Rouse, Birdley. In many ways, Deltarune almost seems like a game about creating a friend group, a place of belonging, a true home. Knives cut the strings of connection that bind us together, force us to fall deeper and deeper into ourselves. The only way to get out of that never-ending downward spiral is to have someone around that can pull you out. Someone that can hold you in their arms. If you take anything away from this video, I hope it's that you shouldn't try to use a metaphorical knife to fill that lingering ever-present void. Instead, make connections. Find people like you. Find people who care. Find a place you fit in. Find a home. That void will never be quenched forever, but if you found that wonderful feeling of belonging and safety, you'll be fine, because you can always come home.